Welcome, everybody, to the first of many virtual policy brown bags that we are hosting in the Ed Leadership Policy Program at Texas Tech University. I'm so happy that you all can join us today for my own talk, so selfishly going to brag about that, but in general, welcoming you to what we think is a pretty cool effort to engage folks from across institutions. I know many of you are here at Texas Tech, but some are not, and talk about some of the work that both we are doing, our students are doing, but then what you'll notice about this year's series is almost everybody is from other institutions. And so this sort of cross-pollination effort and disseminating research, particularly research that's in progress, is something that we value and strive as faculty, and so are really pleased to host another year of this brown bag. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership Policy Program at Texas Tech University in the College of Education. I'm saying that this is still my first year because COVID year doesn't count. I didn't get to meet as many people as I would have liked, but I am a second year. This is my second year in the program. Largely, my research is focused in 3 or 4 big areas. I'm generally interested in documenting the unintended consequences of education and other public policies, and leveraging big data to make win-win policies and empower policymakers and decision makers to make equitable decisions with the data they have, to both support the longevity of policy, then also just understand the impacts and their own context. So I think you'll get a little bit of that today. One of my big arms of my research is documenting the impacts of immigration enforcement on students and educators in schools. So I'm really excited to talk to you about some ongoing work that I have with my really good friend and colleague, Dr. Carolyn Sattin-Bajaj over at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who also happened to serve on my dissertation committee and is in many ways a large reason why I am still doing this work today. So I'm not going to, further introduce myself. I'm really excited to kick off the series with my own talk, but before I kind of proceed, I would encourage you all to look at this amazing slate of speakers that we have scheduled for this year, colleagues and friends who have generously agreed to, share their time and talk about their exciting work. But now to transition into the topic for today. I'm going to share my screen. You should be able to see that. If for whatever reason you can't, add it in the chat or unmute yourself and talk. Like I said, this is ongoing work that I have with Carolyn Sattin-Bajaj at UCSB, looking at kind of extending our work in the immigration enforcement space by looking at what happened after a North Texas raid occurred. And this is actually one of the largest raids during the Trump administration. The immigration raids where folks, over 200 people were arrested in relation to this raid. And actually, my colleague is just joining us. So let me actually pause this for just a second. And Carolyn, not to put you on the spot, but do you want to introduce yourself? And I already told them that you are a big reason for me doing this work, and it's awesome to collaborate with such an amazing colleague and former dissertation committee member. But do you want to maybe introduce yourself? If I caught you off guard, I can keep.
Hi, I think I just joined. You're talking to me, right?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry I'm late, but I'm glad I came at the right time. I'm so happy to get to watch Jacob share this really exciting new work, that he is the mastermind and so much of this work. So I'm Carolyn Sattin-Bajaj. I'm an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara. I'm a qualitative researcher with a lot of quantitative ideas, and Jacob is a quantitative researcher with a lot of skills and ideas, and so we're a really good pair working together off of each other, and I'm just thrilled to get to hear this work with a Texas audience.
Thank you.
Is that good, Jacob? Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so back to, yeah, so let's start out by talking a little bit about the context that Carolyn and I have talked a lot about, and we found ourselves when we first started this work, in pretty high, I would say, anti-immigrant rhetoric that very much shaped the policy context. But a little bit of background, if you've read any of the research that preceded this work that has noted spillover effects from immigration enforcement on students, a lot of that research actually focuses on the first term of the Obama administration. Some people don't know this, but during the first term of the Obama administration, this was the presidential administration that had arguably the largest increase in rates of deportations, primarily though under Homeland Security investigations, which this is one of three branches of the Office of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE. And Homeland Security investigations are primarily focused on organized crime, domestic terrorism, like a lot more, I would say, like more serious crimes and more serious threats. Whereas, as I'll talk about in just a minute, during the Trump administration, we saw a lot higher numbers of deportations occurring under the enforcement and removal operations of ICE, which has a lot more discretion in terms of who it arrests and like what constitutes, violating the law. They have a much broader, I think, kind of like mandate to remove unauthorized persons from the United States. Another fact about the Obama administration that's important, even though I would say largely the research that has looked at the effects of deportations during his first term finds generally negative findings. That is to say that there are negative educational impacts or direct impacts on immigrants based on these deportations. But even considering that during the Obama administration, and particularly emphasized during his second term, the administration largely adhered to what they call sensitive locations guidelines. And that's where you may have heard that ICE tends to not come on school grounds or won't show up to political demonstrations or protests or churches. There are these sensitive locations that generally ICE kind of abided by during this term. And in fact, it was the first presidential administration that issued a letter, basically stating its position that it would not kind of encourage immigration officials to go into these areas. Before that, it was just kind of like an unspoken kind of rule that presidential administrations adhered to. During the Obama administration, there was also large increases in funding for ICE, and this continued during the Trump administration. But following when Donald Trump was elected, again, we saw spikes in deportations, particularly under that branch of ICE, the enforcement and removal operations. During Trump's first term, one of the first things he did was also renew this secure communities policy. Secure communities is this policy that essentially kind of links this fingerprint system with local authorities and automatically uploads fingerprints from those who are detained to ICE's database to cross-check for whether the person is suspected to be unauthorized. And so this kind of renewed and was just one of many policies during the Trump administration that signaled greater cooperation between ICE and local officials in order to carry out immigration enforcement. Also saw an increase in the number of 287G programs that essentially allows ICE to have these sort of like MOUs or agreements with local communities to both train and also kind of have greater jurisdiction once that they arrest somebody that they believe to be unauthorized. Also during the Trump administration, we saw a less focus on criminal records as being one of the kind of like big reasons someone would be deported. Folks would be deported not just, if they committed a crime, but, if they had a DUI or just in general kind of had a run-in with ICE. And then finally, during the Trump administration, I mean, I'm sure all of us saw lots of headlines, with various raids that were occurring or threats coming from the administration, but also for the first time, there were reports of ICE coming onto school grounds and arresting like an 18-year-old in North Carolina on his way to school So these kind of were the first time that I think these reports were becoming mainstream, and something that would be suspected to be common practice from the administration's enforcement arm. Where we situate a lot of our work is thinking about how immigration enforcement can impact schools. So the visual you're showing was actually put together by a good friend and colleague of mine, Christopher Azuna, also at UCSB. And it shows you every dot is a school district that's within 100 miles of a deportation that occurred between 2009 and 2016. This was for another paper that we had written, and I'll kind of show you where that is if you're interested. But the darker the dot, or the red and the orange, show those that are closer to the deportation activity within 25 miles, or 26 and 50 miles, and you can see it kind of bellows out from there. But the point is to say that I think a lot of the time when we think about, where are the concentrated, removals occurring, certainly, you have Border Patrol, which is that last branch of ICE that carries out a lot of the enforcement operations at the border. But the enforcement and removal operations, which is what this graphic is showing you, I mean, these occur all across the country. I mean, for the most part, focused in like large cities, but even you can see some spots of this where this is occurring in more rural areas, or more suburban areas. So, it's not just that we are focused on the border states. This is an issue that potentially impacts schools across the country, regardless of geography. One of the ways that we think about, based on prior research and kind of informing our own work, is that immigration enforcement certainly has direct effects for immigrants and children of immigrants. And so this isn't to be confused with some of our work. I mean, we, at least to date, have not worked on stuff, and by we, I mean Carolyn and I have not worked on studies documenting the effects for immigrants and children of immigrants. But there is a robust literature in this space that we and others have used to build on in thinking and speculating what there might be other kind of ripple effects that are occurring for others beyond just children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. And then also, and one of the kind of ways to think about it is, right, children of immigrants attending schools have friends, right? And friends who either do or do not know their friends, status, or just in general, like having a friend who's more upset the next day or has experienced trauma. These are collateral side effects that can spill over into communities more broadly. But certainly when communities have concentrations of, immigrant origin populations that are more subject to the impacts both directly from enforcement, but then also thinking about like mental and like climate impacts, like just being in or being from backgrounds that is, under constant scrutiny from, at the highest level of government, and in kind of issues of being not welcome or not having a sense of belonging. And so this is the climate that we think could breed, really unfortunate educational consequences for students broadly, but particularly students from certain backgrounds, whether that just be Latinx backgrounds, which arguably most of the rhetoric during the Trump administration was targeted towards folks from Latinx backgrounds. Thinking about how those characteristics shape your experience when in a community that's being impacted by enforcement is something that we're really interested in and build in our work. A lot of folks have used, various kind of conceptual guides. I would say the most common way that educational and social science researchers to date have thought about, exploring the impacts of enforcement on children, regardless of immigrant status, is extending Joanna Drebby's pyramid of immigration enforcement, which it's not shown here, but at the very top, we think about it as there are direct effects for immigrants, such as being removed from the country and family structures breaking down, financials being impacted. But then as the triangle expands down, it kind of thinks about enforcement as kind of broadly impacting, conversations and confusion about like authorized status for maybe children who are not having these conversations with their family, now they are. But one of the things we kind of layer into that conceptual underpinning of how we think immigration enforcement can impact students in schools is extending this community violence framework that that describes how immigration enforcement can act as one form of community violence. And so thinking about how it impacts students in multiple ways, right? So having direct academic impacts, but also health impacts or social impacts, and how that can then occur in all sorts of these kind of using like an ecological framework, all these different systems. So like in the home, in the school, in the community. And so taking these two conceptual frameworks together, we extend our consideration of who could be impacted by enforcement to not just immigrant origin students, but Latinx students, students who are English learners, and even just first generation students more broadly. So I spoke at the beginning of this talk a little bit about how Carolyn introduced me to this work. To be a little bit more specific, Carolyn and I authored this book chapter as part of my former advisor's book, Absent from School, where we were kind of just very generally interested, pretty new, I would say, to the immigration and education literature, at least I was. But we were generally interested in, is there a relationship between immigration enforcement and absenteeism rates for immigrant origin children? So this was our first step into this work. We used pretty descriptive methods. I would say the findings that are most kind of stand out from that chapter for me is that we find for secondary students in particular, immigration enforcement did relate to higher absences. And so this was kind of our first, I think we considered it mostly like a pilot run at how we think about and write about these issues and how do we examine these issues analytically. And then we built on this by submitting for a special issue in AERA Open, where we focused on using the Stanford Education Data Archive, or SEDA, which I know I've spoken to some of you on the call about, and giving a national picture of what we saw at a very aggregate level. So focusing at the district level, do we see changes in a set of outcomes when that district is near deportations and those deportations increase? And so what we examined in this piece is looking at, does academic achievement change overall in the district, and by race and ethnicity? Does chronic absenteeism or rates of chronic absenteeism change? And then do we see variation in kind of incidents of bullying that came up? And what we found is we had replicated some prior research showing that there were small negative effects on math achievement, particularly Latinx math achievement, as deportations increased within 25 miles of a school district. And we also found probably the largest effects was increase in chronic absenteeism rates among Latinx students in the district when deportations increased and that district was within 25 miles of those deportations. We did not find anything related to bullying or even reports of bullying based on race. And that's important because that was something that we were a little surprised about, just based on some of the qualitative work in this area and then what we just kind of generally thought we would find. But we were able to kind of extend our hypotheses in thinking, okay, so students must, or like we should consider other measures of ways students may be impacted non-academically. And so in our latest piece, which I hope you'll go check out, it was just published in AERA Open again, we leveraged student level data in the California core districts where we were able to, replicate a lot of what we had done before. So we found, immigration arrests occurring nearby related to declines in math achievement for Latinx and most strongly Latinx English learners. So having that kind of granular student level data allowed us to get a bit more detailed there. And then also we explored, we replicated findings with chronic absenteeism. So showing that as deportations increased, chronic absenteeism went up. And then finally, what's unique about the core district data in California is they have measures of school climate and safety. And so we did find on various different measures of school climate and safety, sense of belonging, viewing your school as safe, declines in these measures concentrated again for students who are Latinx, and in particular, Latinx students who are English learners. And then finally, the last kind of shout out to my work before I get more specifically into the study that I'll be focusing on today is also kind of broadening our scope and not just considering students to be impacted, but also their teachers. This piece was just published in the Journal of Teacher Education. I also hope you'll check it out. It builds on Patricia Gandara's work at the UCLA Civil Rights Project in exploring how educators perceive immigration enforcement. Do they perceive themselves as prepared to support their students who are impacted by enforcement, and how does that relate to their job satisfaction? I'll save we find kind of similar things to what you would expect, but I'll save kind of the summary of that just to save on time a little bit, but go check it out. So the current study, the context motivating us here is thinking about what happens in a community, particularly a community that is not all that populous, when 200 plus individuals are arrested as a result of a workplace raid in North Texas. This was one of the largest, if not the largest, immigration raid that occurred during the Trump administration. And this sets the stage for us. And I'll kind of contextualize why this is important to consider both in terms of the data we have access to, but then also methodological innovations that we build on with this study to really improve our understanding of not just what the impacts are, but who is being impacted most by immigration enforcement, which I think has direct implications for how we respond and can support students during these times. So kind of summarizing a little bit of the background I've already gone over, but also giving just a few additional studies that you can check out if you're interested. There is a growing literature on the effect of deportations and raids and on academics, and particularly I would say math and reading most commonly has been explored. We know in general there are race and ethnicity disparities in achievement, and so the reason that's important is if we think that deportations or immigration enforcement more broadly is impacting certain student demographic groups more than others, or not affecting other students at all, then this has the potential, just based on prior research, to exacerbate these achievement gaps that we've tried so hard as educators to diminish. Prior research has noted that there's consequences to math and attendance rates. There's also and perceptions of school climate and safety. So I've kind of summarized that already for you. But then others, not just examining deportations and raids, kind of as a continuous measure, but more broadly immigration policies that go into effect, have also shown that there might be declines related to immigration enforcement on Latinx communities. In particular, Laura Bellows in her AERA Open study found that there were declines for Latinx and Black students in English achievement upon a secure communities rollout in North Carolina. So it's a really interesting study, and she does a really great job of talking about population effects and what she's accounting for there. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. And then Dee and Murphy have also shown, following the rollout of 287G agreements in California, that there was an increase in mobility for Latinx students in the county. So a lot more students exiting schools and leaving following these 287G agreements, which again, just recall, these are the local agreements made between ICE and local counties, basically bolstering their jurisdiction and ability to enforce immigration enforcement at those local levels. So kind of summarizing the themes from prior research, these are the three themes that stick out to me. We think that students might stop coming to school. They either could be leaving schools, higher mobility, or they could just be more absent from school. We see academic declines. Depending on which study you read, some are math declines, some are English declines. And then potentially, this is the most recent study we did, is potentially impacting school climate. And so do students feel a sense of belonging? Do they feel safe in school? And might that be one of the mechanisms kind of underpinning some of these other outcomes that we've been exploring? But there's really key limitations from prior research, and that's something I really am going to try and convince you of today. Because first, when it comes to data, for good reason, we lack information on students, immigrant origin, their status. I mean, again, for good reason. But what this means is that if we don't have accurate data on who we think is likely to be the most impacted, then it limits our ability to generalize and kind of contextualize results for populations that we suspect are most impacted. And so as a result, and as you've heard me talk about a lot of prior research as a result has examined associations for Latinx students and Latinx English learners who are often the target of anti-immigrant rhetoric at the federal level. We also, from a data perspective, lack a lot of longitudinal and student level data. So a lot of the longitudinal data that does exist, exists at these aggregate forums. And so you can kind of think about like, what can you say about how deportations affect school or district level trends in outcomes? But can you actually make an inference about students at the student level and get a lot more granular in documenting these effects? That was one of the signature contributions of our last study, is having that rich student level data. But then not just do we lack the data to make these types of claims and inferences and really understand the potential impacts of immigration enforcement, but we lack oftentimes an appropriate identification strategy. And what I mean by that is immigration enforcement cannot just be assumed to be random. Immigration enforcement corresponds to other, observed and unobserved things that are happening in schools, that are happening in communities. Just like most generally speaking, right? Like the border states, or even just thinking of Texas, the border area of Texas does not look the same as other areas of Texas, right? So if we wanted to look at where the most concentrated areas of enforcement are, these areas just look so different from others that it's really hard to make any sort of claims about, well, is it really immigration enforcement that's causing this, or is it other kind of broader population trends, or other things that could be going on, other policies that affect these communities? Not only that, but then the limited research that does attempt to make causal claims, and I say attempt because I don't think they make causal claims, or at least they shouldn't be making causal claims, is that there are methods that they're using while previously kind of were accepted as suitable causal designs. So I'm thinking of difference and differences, namely, these methods are facing increased scrutiny in both like the economic literature, the stats literature, as not being as reliable in replicating what we would see or find in a randomized control trial. I mean, the entire point of a quasi-experiment and using these types of methods is being able to, ascertain or replicate the same types of effects that you would get from randomizing, from treatment to control. In our case, the treatment is, immigration enforcement, so it's not as, great to think about it that way. But in other words, we need to do better. We need to have better methods. We need to have better data in order to make the claims that we need to be making in order to kind of move the agenda forward and figure out best ways to support who's being impacted based on how they're being impacted and what our data can tell us. So that lays the groundwork for this study, where a raid occurs without warning. And it was not only, without warning, it was very large in what is pretty isolated in terms of the communities that were impacted. And so with that context in mind, the research questions we asked is, what is the immediate and sustained effects of exposure to a large-scale immigration raid on the academic and behavioral outcomes of students attending local schools, the schools who were in the counties that were likely impacted? Do these effects differ based on student level characteristics, such as whether the students are Latinx, whether the students are English learners, and whether the students are immigrants? A little bit of context on the counties that were impacted by this particular raid. You may be asking, well, if a raid, occurs in one area, how are you saying that there were 4 counties potentially impacted? Well, where the raid occurred, it was actually a very rural, remote area, and thus we assume a vast majority of the employees were likely commuting to work, and thus their children could be attending schools in any kind of geographically proximal area. And so what we did is we first sought out to figure out, okay, can we figure out from the data which of the North Texas counties that kind of were around this area were impacted. So I would show you a map, but I haven't, really decided how much I want to emphasize where this occurred. But the raid occurred smack dab in the middle of 4 counties, like at the border of 4 different counties. And so what we did is we looked at, okay, so using data from the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, or TRAC, which compiles, to our knowledge, the most comprehensive set of longitudinal information on immigration arrests occurring by month and by county in the country, we saw spikes in just 4 of the counties. And we looked at dozens of counties surrounding this area. And these were the only 4 that experienced spikes in the immigration arrest that occurred and were reported in the county. So we believe that these were the 4 counties where folks who were impacted most directly by the raid were living, and thus the schools in these counties, to our kind of speculation, would be suspected as being most likely impacted. The 4 counties, which are pretty large, do host a diverse and rural and suburban communities. Total population among the 4 counties is just over 300,000 people, which sounds like a lot, but Texas is massive and it's 4 counties and it's really not that big. But it's not super remote and rural either. The most common sectors in these 4 counties are manufacturing, and the schools themselves, actually, the education sectors employ the second highest number of folks in the county. So that's a little bit of contextual information about the counties that we consider to be potentially impacted by this raid. The data we're using comes from the University of Houston's Education Research Center. This houses the Texas statewide longitudinal data system spanning early childhood through the workforce. By that, we mean students are linked via social security numbers and date of births from all of the major statewide data systems, including the Texas Education Agency, the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and the Texas Workforce Commission. So we link them through from K through 12 to higher ed and to the workforce. I'm not going to show you some of that today, but it kind of tells you where we're headed with this study. So these 4 counties consist of 142 schools that serve over 50,000 students each year. And we focus on data spanning 2012 through 2020. One thing that's not in here that should be is the raid occurred in 2018, right at the beginning of the school year, in like the 3rd week of August. So we have a lot of years prior to the raid and 2 to 3 years post-raid that we're going to be looking at as part of this study. As part of the broader study that we have embarked on, we are going to look at both short-run and long-run outcomes. The short-run outcomes come mostly from the Texas Education Agency. So I'm interested in replicating what we found basically so far. Do we see differences in attendance, in discipline, based on in and out of school suspensions, and then in math and reading STAR scores? Just given how Texas tests their students, we're going to be focusing on grades 3 through 8 only for the STAR scores, but we are interested in potentially looking at other academic outcomes as well. And then in the long run, in general, what prior research hasn't really looked at is like the overall trajectory of what happens to a student following immigration enforcement raid. And so we're going to look at, just for starters, 2-year and 4-year post-secondary enrollment, as well as employment following high school or post-secondary. So do students, what industries do they go into? Are they more or less likely to be employed? And then wages, something that also comes from the Workforce Commission. For today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on attendance during the first 6-week period, which is when the raid occurred, discipline, and then 2-year and 4-year post-secondary enrollment. So tracking just the students from the 2018 graduating cohort and see their post-secondary enrollment behaviors. So here's some measures. This doesn't actually tell you a whole lot. Overall, pretty high attendance rate in the county compared to national averages, and probably your average suspension rate. This is the descriptive statistics in the North Texas counties prior to the 2018 raid. So this is the 2017-2018 school year. And then the student characteristics of the district. So you'll notice this isn't super representative of Texas. So there is a lower number of Latinx students and English learners and immigrant students broadly. But again, like we're interested in these particular students in the district, and can we make some sort of claim about what happens to them, even though it doesn't appear that they're in as high of Latinx or as high of English learner dense schools as many areas across Texas and across the country. The analytic approach that we use here is called the synthetic control method. This was developed, it's a very new causal method that, extends a difference in difference style framework. It was developed by Abadi and colleagues in 2010. If you're interested, their study focuses on the tobacco law passed in California on cigarette sales. And what we do is we use this method to chart a counterfactual post-raid path for schools. So basically, we never get to see what happens to the schools that were impacted after the raid occurred and pretend that the raid didn't occur, right? That would be the only way we could truly make a true claim of causality, if we actually knew for a fact what would happen to them had the raid not occurred and compare there. And so what we do is we construct this synthetic control, drawing from all the districts across the state of Texas, using a weighted average of the comparison units. So they're called donor pools, so to speak, and they basically donate their characteristics, and we weight them to construct our synthetic control that we use, particularly with a lot of lagged measures on the outcomes of interest. So lagged achievement, lagged attendance, lagged disciplinary rates. And this is a much better way to make an inference of what might have happened to the schools impacted by the raid compared to just doing a simple before and after and kind of selecting an average of other units that weren't impacted. And this is one way, along with other kind of methods that maybe some of you are familiar with, propensity score matching, combination with difference and differences, and then just a difference and differences, and doing a lot of work to justify the parallel lines trends assumption. This is another way to balance those pre-raid school level characteristics, as schools near the raid, as I've mentioned before, are not going to look like other schools across the state. They just look very differently based on their geography and based on their characteristics. And we can't assume that that's unrelated to the raid itself. So a couple more analytic details here for those interested in maybe applying the synthetic control method to your own work. We use control units from across the state, but because the synthetic control method literally takes 72 hours to run with this big of a data set, we limited it to control units, or that by that I mean schools that were traditional public schools in Texas, had enrollment and race and ethnicity compositions within 1 standard deviation of the treated districts, or those districts that were impacted by the raid, and then contain data for all the years we examined. And then once you calculate the weights for the control units based on their covariates, and you have a set number of donors, for our case, we pulled from overall 900 donors or districts from across the state that constituted our synthetic control. Once you have your control, you have set up just a very basic diff and diff framework where you are looking at the post outcome. So what happens after the raid in the North Texas counties, and what happens after the raid for the synthetic control, subtract those two out from what you observed prior to the raid. So the pre-outcome from the North Texas County minus the pre-outcome from the synthetic control counties. And this yields the treatment effect. For those of you who are familiar with the diff and diff and the difference and differences with matching, I'm actually showing you both results paired with the synthetic control method. These are preliminary, so let me stress that. Right now, these may change, particularly as the synthetic control method is very new and we continue to kind of like explore and read up on the methodological literature to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make the most accurate inferences as possible. Across the board, we find when looking at overall absences and suspensions in the districts that were impacted, we saw slight increases in absenteeism and slight, I would say moderate increases in suspensions for students in these schools compared to the counterfactual, which is a synthetic control. When looking more specifically at Latinx English learners and Latinx English learners, so students who share both of those characteristics, these estimates double and in some cases triple, depending on which outcome you're looking at, but particularly focused on the synthetic control method, since that's what I would argue is the closest to the most credibly causal estimates here. The highest effects we observe are for Latinx English learners who, compared to the synthetic control, experienced on average a 5 percentage point higher absenteeism rate and a 6 percentage point higher suspension rate among these students than they otherwise would have if the rate had not occurred. When looking at post-secondary enrollment, we find small but still meaningful effects. And sorry, this table is not formatted correctly. I don't know why the color is showing up like that. But we find small but meaningful declines in post-secondary outcomes. And so in other words, I'm just showing you the Latinx and Latinx English learner populations. These populations had 1 to 3 percentage point lower likelihood of enrolling in post-secondary institutions after the raid occurred than they otherwise would have had the raid not occurred. And this is compared to the synthetic control that we constructed using the donor districts from across the state. Now, some of you may hate looking at regression coefficients, and so I put together a couple of synthetic control graphs. I don't love what Stata has done so far in this, so I made these in Excel just based on the results from Stata. But ultimately, what we're looking at here is the synthetic control is this right here. It doesn't have to be at the same magnitude. What we're focused on is constructing a synthetic control that has the exact same trend prior to the raid as the treated counties or the districts in the counties that were impacted. And you can see that we do exactly that. And this is just by nature of having access to thousands of schools across the state. We do that for both suspension rates and the first 6 weeks attendance rate. Prior to the raid, which occurred in 2018, these were nearly identical in terms of their trends. But right as the raid occurred, you can see that there's both immediate impacts, so sharp increases in suspension rates and absenteeism rates, but then also the trend itself changes. So we actually see that suspensions were before going down slightly and attendance before was going down or at least plateauing. And now the trend increases post-raid. So that is looking in years 19 and 20, we find that the rate for the Latinx English learners in these districts is actually getting worse. So suspensions are getting higher and the absence rates are getting higher. So I'm going to wrap up because I'd much rather hear questions from you and kind of engage us in some discussion around this. But what I hope you're kind of taking away from this is, we really sought out to replicate what I think is not a mixed literature per se, but it's just new. And so replicating some of the effects that we found in prior, more descriptive research, I think is really important as a contribution to the knowledge gap of what we know of like how students are impacted and who's impacted and in what ways. Overall, the results are suggesting we're still early. There's other outcomes we want to explore. And we're going to wait a few years until students have a chance to maybe complete post-secondary or attain a career. But so far, results tend to suggest negative impacts, both immediate impacts and sustained changes in the trend of these academic impacts in schools. But we still do need to do more follow-up and examine some of the long-run impacts on students and various kind of student demographics. So the implications, and something Carolyn and I are still wrestling with as we are writing up findings from our AERA Open study in a policy brief for the California kind of like stakeholders and schools and districts, is so knowing these effects, right, is one thing, but now what do we do with these results? How can schools best support students subject to the impacts of immigration enforcement? How can their educators and teachers, how can out-of-school stakeholders support students and families? And so, Emily Crawford in particular has done some work looking at professional development opportunities for educators. Sofia Rodriguez has done some work looking at the role of school counselors play in discussions of policies and decisions that have disparate impacts for immigrant origin students. So I turn you to some of their work that that very much informs the direction of our own. And so that is the end of this talk, but we have about 12 minutes for questions that I and Carolyn would love to answer if you have any. So if you have any questions, feel free to just like unmute yourself. Assuming I haven't made it to where, yeah, no, you can unmute yourself.
Should I ask a question of the audience? If there's no questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Are there folks who are principals or right now working in schools in Texas?
Yeah.
There's some folks. So I'd be interested to hear, so this is maybe the most extreme evidence source of RAID and direct impact. There's a real question. So ask someone else's question, but my question for the educators or the folks who are working in Texas on the ground, and before I went to UCSB, I was in an ed leadership program in New Jersey, so I miss having contact with the school and district leaders who really know what's going on. Not that the doctoral students who are not don't know what's going on, but different. So I'm just interested in like, what were the things that you might have seen or experienced from your position or seen among your staff and students post 2017 presidential election, if you particularly in schools with large immigrant origin populations. If the rate is the most extreme, we're also interested in other ways to try to get at how did the experience of being a student or a teacher of young people who are immigrant origin, how is it influenced by the broader political climate and the immigration policy context that we might not capture in this kind of study that's looking at a RAID? So that's my question to you.
I'll go ahead and jump in, and I've mentioned this to Dr. Kirksey, and I'm glad he brought up the border region being completely different. I teach in El Paso, Texas, so we've never seen any of these extremes. We actually have students who wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning from Juarez, come across, and they go to school. They're there by 5:36 in the morning. There's buses that pick them up at the International Bridge and bring them over. And there's also students who stay with relatives throughout the week in El Paso and then head out for the weekend, and they lose opportunities for extracurricular activities because of this. And so we haven't seen in El Paso, we haven't seen the extreme. It was felt when the immigration policies came through, especially especially right now with COVID. A lot of students had to stay in the United States instead of going back to Juarez, or were stuck in Juarez during the pandemic and doing everything virtual. So those are just little key perspectives from the El Paso regions. And I'm glad that Dr. Kirksey pointed out that the borderline community is completely different when it comes to, especially in the El Paso area, when it comes to other parts of the United States.
Well, I would just say in some ways, probably better equipped than lots of other places because you've lived that and you've served these groups of students and their families for a long time, and probably a lot of lessons that maybe aren't even articulated, but are so built into your practices that other districts that are seeing versions of some of the challenges who might not be. I mean, when we think about places that have not served immigrant origin students, we think about Iowa or South Carolina at the beginning, not Texas, but we're seeing like there are places in Texas that also don't have large populations that have to deal with some of the consequences of immigration policy. So all these potential opportunities I see, like knowing there's someone from El Paso, probably folks from all over Texas, so much opportunity for sharing best practice and ideas.
I work with migrant students with a migrant program in West Texas. One of the things that I've seen recently is a lot of families have decided, are fearful and have decided to homeschool their children, and knowing that they're in these farms or dairy farms or all types with no internet, but being homeschooled. And we actually just got a call this morning of some young children not going to school and missing 18 out of the 30 something days of school. And the recommendation from the district was, why don't they homeschool the children? And I'm like, homeschool? But I also do professional development for districts. But when we do professional development on like how to support your immigrant children or undocumented resources for undocumented students, for the past, I don't know, 6 years, when we do these trainings for districts, I get 0 participants. And one of the things that always come from our administrators and teachers is like, oh, we don't have any students like that, or like there's none in our area like that. It's like, yes, you do. But so it makes it a little bit difficult. I saw like a recommendation of providing professional development. Like, I've tried, Dr. Kirksey. Like, I have really tried. Like, even like if you attend this session, you'll get, there's like free stuff, but it's very difficult. So that's something I've been seeing here in our area lately. Thank you for sharing too.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of underscore what you just said. I mean, we have so much to learn about what is and isn't working. Like, are there kind of like schools that are successful in raising awareness of among teachers? I mean, I think that's kind of like one of the first, at least themes I've seen from research is first, like, do educators know what's happening? Like, and do they know like why that's important? So that piece that I just published in the Journal of Teacher Ed, you might be really interested in that, you know, because the motivation was to start with, when are you becoming an educator at the very beginning, and kind of have conversations about immigration policy and opportunities to engage with immigrant families in your field placement. Because if you don't have those opportunities now, and when you're trying to learn what best practice is, then what happens, you know, later? And might those professional development opportunities you're talking about, Monica, be futile at that point?
I was just going to say, thank you, Monica, because that's so distressing, but also useful to hear. And sometimes whenever I talk to folks who want to work with districts, I worked in the New York City Department of Ed a long time ago, and like how I always try to think about, well, how can we make it useful for them? Not just we're collecting data, we're doing research. And in your case, you're trying to make something useful for your colleagues or whoever you're delivering professional development. But if there are teachers who, for whatever reason, either they don't recognize that they're undocumented students, or maybe they have their own political beliefs that they don't think their time should be spent serving students who are undocumented, which I hope that's not the case, but we know that is a reality. That figuring out like, well, how can we deliver something that will help them solve whatever problem they're having, or like meet their needs? And so maybe it's strategies for English learners, or some other way of parent engagement, or something that's kind of a broader tent in which you then sneak in some of the stuff that you know they need to know about undocumented students or other ways. So that's sort of how I, when I talk about teaching immigration, I don't want to have to be the kind of functionalist. Like, how do we make sure everyone cares about? And so that's why this sort of spillover thing is, the broader the tent, the more people we can show are negatively impacted by these actions, the more people will care. Even though I wish people would just care about the people who are directly impacted, that might not work. So how do we figure out how to measure the broader impacts and then engage a broader community to want to do something about? Anyway.
So an interesting comment which happened last week, because I was at the farm with the students. So I asked the students why they weren't going back to school, the younger ones who were like 13, 14. And they said, well, we didn't really like school because we weren't learning much. And so when the pandemic hit, we just thought it was our way out. Like, okay, well, now I don't have to go to school. And so now they're working. And it's like, but nobody's checking up on these kids and following up with these kids, and they're being homeschooled. And which we know that's not, they're not. And so I find it really interesting that we lose track of a lot of these kids.
Absolutely. Julie, sorry, you've had your hand up for a while.
I was just gonna to add kind of on to what Ramon said. So I'm from a border community and I live in West Texas now, but it is so very different. And what we're seeing and hearing, and so to clarify, I'm not a K through 12 person, I'm in higher ed, and public health is my background. But what we're seeing down there, it's almost the flip side, because we're seeing several hundred kids a day that are being assimilated into our school systems down there. So talking to administrators, that's the challenge right now for them, but they do it. Like, to not even consider that, that's not even a thought. So it's so very different. Now where I am in West Texas, I can tell you that the raids impact when the restaurants, which restaurants are open or closed. Like, that's how we see what the raids impact. And a raid has happened when certain restaurants were closed. And so I think it's really interesting. But certainly lessons learned. It's just border communities. I never heard of an ICE raid living there, growing up my whole life, because that's crazy. Like, you would never do that. And we don't ask to see it. We don't care if someone has documentation or not, like for health or education or whatever. So I was just going to throw that in there, that I think maybe there's an opportunity. And now it's almost like there's a different problem with the immigration situations. There's both sides of it.
And Victoria in the chat asks, what, in your professional opinions, what do you believe the role of P through 12 practitioners to be in reference to addressing deportations? Carolyn, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And that's sort of some of the questions that I am interested in exploring through research, is like, what do school leaders think their roles are, and how might that vary based on local context, and what they're learning from their school board is prioritized and matters. So I think at a minimum, everyone should know about Plyler versus Doe and the Supreme Court case that says that any student is legally entitled to a free public education regardless of their legal status. And so we have the extremes on both sides, where schools are offering legal counseling and services and know your rights clinics for families and students and teachers. And then on the other side, schools that are violating that law and asking for documentation or papers or social security cards for enrollment in ways to block. So I think at a minimum, principals have to enforce the law and should know about it, and should ensure that their teachers know about it. And I would hope that the goal of administrators is to create a warm, inclusive environment where students feel safe and they belong, in order to create the foundation for learning to happen, and social emotional development, and all of the things that schools are designed, hopefully, to do for kids. So in a place with large numbers of immigrant origin youth, many of whom might be undocumented or live in mixed status families, I think that calls for more than just the baseline, not barring enrollment, but training teachers and maybe training staff on trauma-informed care and culturally responsive teaching, and ways to incorporate migration and immigration histories in their approaches to learning. And yeah, I think it could span a whole. So GLSEN is an organization that every year does an annual survey of students about the climate, for LGBTQ students, about the climate in their schools and their sense of belonging. They have really powerful findings about practices that dramatically affect students' well-being, these LGBTQ students and other students' well-being in the building, including signaling affirmation. If one teacher has I am an ally sign in their room, that can really change a student's experience. If there's clear policies on inclusivity and very strong responses to bullying and victimization. So I think there's a lot we can learn from their many, many years of work and transfer it to creating spaces for immigrant students. And I think the administrators are the ones it really starts from the top. So if they signal that matters, then all the resources and symbolic supports follow.
All right, well, we are at time. I want to be respectful of your time, and I know many of you are actually joining us from work, so that's awesome. Thanks again to my colleague, Carolyn. So good to see you, and thanks for helping me. We call Carolyn the ideas gal because she's really great and just always makes me a better scholar in everything I do. So
I call myself that, and Jacob is the ideas guy and the methods guy. So I mean, this is like, and it's just so exciting to get to work with data in Texas, and there's so much to learn. It's so impressive, this turnout. I want to keep coming back and learning from you all.
Yeah. So last plug before I let you all go, please join us in 2 weeks for Carrie Conaway from Harvard. She's going to talk about 5 ways research partnerships can fail. She joined my class last year and gave an incredible talk and presentation. So it's a little bit of a teaser. I'm sure you all are going to love it. Similar to Carolyn, the way she just kind of thinks about things in education policy blows my mind, and I kind of learn from her in every way. So please join us in 2 weeks, same time, October 26th, noon to 1. Without further ado, see you all on the flip side. Thanks again, Carolyn, for joining. Have a good rest of your week.